All right, so let's talk about Turki Al-Sheikh. Without question, Turki Al-Sheikh has become the power broker in boxing. Now, what I mean by that is he has pretty much played the middleman of getting these promoters to essentially like lease their fighters onto his brand or his platform to put on fights that, truthfully, I don't know if they get made 4 or 5 years ago. Since Turki Al-Sheikh has been in the picture, we have gotten Artur Beterbiev and Dimitri Bivol fight not once, but twice. We're about a month and change away from Canelo Alvarez and Terence Crawford fighting at Allegiant Stadium. He's playing a big part in co-promoting that with TKO, Dana White. I'll get to that in a second. But needless to say, these days of the PBC and Top Rank and Matchroom and Queensberry and Golden Boy all now being on the same card or working together is starting to get erased because of his influence. I feel what Turkey is essentially in the modern day is kind of a hybrid of what HBO essentially was during their time. HBO was a platform that was an open door to all the promoters. And at one point, there was a lot of kickback from the major networks, the ABCs and the CBSs of the world that were the home of boxing. But once cable TV became a big deal and it became much more of a norm, and though HBO had boxing from in the late 70s, they really didn't become a powerhouse till like the late 80s into the 90s, where they became the platform for boxing. And why is that? Because HBO had the bread and they would pay the site fees, and they also had people that essentially were boxing people that were at the helm of making sure that the product grew. And ultimately what they ended up doing was developing talent. And you had guys like Alou DeBella, who at one point was in charge of the ship. And if you look at the guys that we ended up seeing in the 90s, I mean, we saw a young Oscar De La Hoya, Roy Jones, later on Floyd Mayweather, Miguel Cotto, and obviously Manny Pacquiao. Once they left boxing, that's when things started to get a little shaky, and the PBC pretty much took over Showtime. Top Rank signs their deal with ESPN. In steps in this new app called DAZN that Golden Boy floods to along with Matchroom. For the better part of 6 to 7 years, this is what boxing has looked like. It's been somewhat of a separation where everybody had their own leagues going on, and every now and then when it deemed necessary, they would, try to get together to work things out. But there was so much red tape that was put in front of these fights being made, unlike any point in the history of boxing we'd ever seen. That's not to say promoters never had issues working together, but when you consider Don King and Bob Arum, who despised each other in the 80s, they just always saw the bigger picture, and they went to an HBO, they went to a Showtime, and they did pay-per-views because they knew ultimately they were gonna break bread and everybody was gonna make money. So in a world where a whole new generation got brought up in this kind of like split up factions of boxing, in steps in Turki Al-Sheikh, who, to be quite honest with you, like, shout out to my man Coltrane, who really, like, he mentioned this like perfect. He was a kid in a candy store because he's got a lot of money or financial backers, but he's a big boxing fan. So needless to say, much of the fights that we have been getting, be it the Riyadh season and now these ring cards, are fights for the most part, man, that I don't think many of us have necessarily complained about. I mean, again, the point that we got 2 fights with Artur Beterbiev and Dimitri Bivol within, like, I think a 2 calendar years is crazy. And this November, to the same point, we're gonna have David Benavidez on the card, along with a Brian Norman Jr., along with a Devin Haney, along with Bam Bam Rodriguez. This would be like impossible 5-6 years ago. So from that perspective, I have to salute Turki Al-Sheikh and their people for at least being the boxing fans that they are, but with, major bank. Now, obviously, there's things to question. TKO this promotion headed by Dana White, along with Turki Al-Sheikh, people are kind of scratching their heads, and a lot of it comes down to this whole notion of them kind of reforming the Muhammad Ali Act. Now, what the Muhammad Ali Act was put in for was so fighters had transparency to negotiations and making sure they knew what everybody was getting paid, so they knew that they were getting paid fairly and, you know, there was no funny business. Now, with the way this is being mapped out as it concerns Turki and Dana White and the TKO group kind of trying to reform this act, it's almost as if they're trying to make boxing like a league kind of structure. Now, look, all of us at some point or another have thought about boxing just being this one big bubble where everybody just fights and there's no issues as it concerns this fighter ducking this fighter or this guy outpricing himself, but there's always two sides to the coin. Because as we've seen over the years, things aren't that simple in boxing. There's like some kind of pay structure that TKO boxing are trying to put together to where it's kind of like a pagoda system. But they're also essentially trying to get rid, I mean, they don't want to say it, but they're essentially trying to get rid of the sanctioning bodies and saying, hey, well, look, if you fight under TKO boxing, you're fighting for the TKO welterweight championship, and it's not gonna deem it necessary for the WBC to step in. Now, they haven't fully said that outright, but if you read between the lines, that's ultimately what this is going to be about. And there's a lot of kickback to that, you know? So ultimately, Turki Al-Sheikh in the immediate has been doing a lot for boxing, man. Let's not kid ourselves here, man. We're living in a world today where in the United States, there is no current network that is covering American boxing. Everything right now is in Europe, be it with Sky Sports. DAZN is a European app. You can obviously get it here, but Top Rank literally just wrapped up their tenure with ESPN, and is me making this video. There's no news yet as it concerns who their broadcaster is going to be. Then you got the PBC. Their business model was predicated on them being exclusive to Showtime. They ran their budget through, and ultimately Showtime went a different direction. They weren't going to host boxing anymore. Why didn't any other network step in to give them a deal? They landed a deal with Amazon Prime, but what a lot of people don't understand is that that deal did not come with a budget. It was a distribution deal where, if you want to relate it to the record industry, it's essentially having a distro deal with Universal, but you gotta pay for the mixing and mastering. You gotta pay for all the marketing. You gotta pay the producers and all that. You package all that up and we'll put it out. That's what a distribution deal is, and you see it a lot in Hollywood too. That's why the PBC have had very minimal dates for their entire tenure so far with Amazon Prime. And it's why you're seeing PBC fighters fight on these Riyadh season cards and these ring cards, because what else are these fighters going to do? Turki Al-Sheikh and Ring and everybody involved in Riyadh season, they haven't monopolized the sport, but ultimately, like I mentioned with HBO, they have become the platform. If you want to make your money and you want to get into big fights, that is the route you're going to have to go. So from the fans' perspective, there's a lot of good, but we also ultimately care about the fighters too. The question mark a lot of us still have is like, how are they really going to work out this Muhammad Ali Act or try to reform it, and or to create this TKO boxing league, which I see in some fashion what they're talking about as far as developing the talent and giving the talent an opportunity to make money coming up. But it gets tricky when you get to the upper echelon, where it's hard to tell a fighter that's sold a lot of tickets and to tell them, well, you're capped at like $1 million. That's the part where I'm still a little shaky about. But overall, it's undisputable at this point that Turki Al-Sheikh is really at the helm of boxing when we talk about the guy that is making moves. So at one point in time, you did hear fighters, and you still kind of do, thank Al Haymon. Now you're hearing to thank Your Excellency Turki Al-Sheikh, which is kind of mind-boggling to me. But what do you think? Is Turki Al-Sheikh good or bad for boxing? I've heard different opinions, and there's opinions that on both sides of the fence are very valid. Let me know, write in the comment section what you think, subscribe, like, and I'll be back soon. Peace.